Alrighty, here we go. As promised, job analysis. So we're at module 2.1. We've got a homework assignment embedded in here, right? The overarching goal of the process then, what do we know? The initial assumption on which we're operating. People differ, as do the requirements of various positions. Okay? So therefore, one must match the person to the requirement of the position. What do you think? It's that simple. Really, we've been talking about the matchmaking process, and conceptually, that's how simple it is. Right, Penelope? Huh? What do you guys think? Is Penelope well matched to steal your hearts during the video? Yeah, sure. A good hire for this position, sweetie. And you work pretty darn cheap, so there's that, right? The better the fit, right? The better the fit, the better the quality, the better the efficiency, and the lower the long-term costs associated with this. And notice, these things almost always go together. As quality goes up, right, costs and profits, costs go down, profits go up. So people say, well, we can't afford to put out a high quality product. They're missing the boat. Conceptually, they've lost it already. Quality is number one, and it's the quality of the hiring process that we're talking about in this course, right? So greater customer satisfaction, both internal and external. And let's get clear on that, right, on that definition. External customers are easy to spot because they're the ones that rent or buy what we offer. Internal customers might be a term that's not as familiar to you. An internal customer is someone who is like next in the process, right? So, for example, when I worked at the paper mill, right, the big machine, the wheel sheeter, takes huge rolls of paper and cuts that rolls of paper in lightning speed to reams, and it shoots out 7 reams of paper at a time, right? And 3 of those reams went to the north line, and the other 4 reams went to the south packaging lines, 2 packaging lines, right? And the wheel sheeter operator, the guy who's operating that machine, right, he sends his finished product, a ream of paper, to 2 packaging operators, of which I was one, right? So I'm the internal customer of the sheeter operator. I mean, it really is that simple, because his process then feeds my process. I'm the recipient of his output. As the recipient of his output, then you can call me the internal customer. Once I take a ream of paper and it runs through the machine that puts the wrapper around it and then puts a label on it and stacks 10, builds a carton around it, and then builds a lid on that, and then puts a label on the carton, and then the carton gets a yellow strap around it to hold it all together. It goes through the conveyor, through a hole in the floor, down to the palletizer, where 40 of those cartons are automatically stacked onto a pallet. Who comes and removes the pallet from the palletizer? Someone who works in the shipping department. So they're my internal customer, right? Because if I mess up, if I'm not watching and labels aren't going on the cartons, or that yellow band isn't going around the carton, or it's heat sealed and it's busting off or something, then my internal customer, the shipping department, they call me up and they say, Mark, what the hell? Are you asleep up there? These cartons are without straps. I'm going to send them all up to you so you can restrap them, right? Dissatisfied customer or satisfied customer, internal customer. Think about the people who've made your life hell in the workplace, if you've been so unfortunate to have that happen. In all likelihood, you are probably their internal customer. Now note that this is usually a bi-directional relationship, but more on that some other time. Take Org Psych if you want to explore that further. Here's the selection paradigm, as we talked about in 2.1. And as I said in Module 2, we're going to take these top 3 boxes, but what this one is about is job analysis. This box right there. So, who benefits from achieving the goal of excellent matchmaking, of an efficient, fair, legal, and well thought out selection process? Well, the candidates, right? And we're going to talk a lot about candidates throughout this course, that we want to have candidates leave the selection process, hired or not, as feeling it was fair, it was just, and it was a high quality operation. We want to look good. Don't most of you want to look good? Well, if we set up tight procedures that are efficient, of high quality, and valid, reliable, if you will, then people will walk away feeling better about their participation, whether they're hired or not, right? So that's the who's, candidates, the employees. Man, if we do a good job of hiring, employees will grow to love us because they say, man, look at the people you brought me to work with. You know, these people are cool, nicely done, right? And also notice the candidate becomes the employee. So again, if we do a good matchmaking process, the employee comes back and says, you did a good job of hiring me, right? The organizations benefit as a result of this, and this is who we ultimately, right, are doing it for? No, we're not. We're ultimately doing it for the customer, right? Well, wait, let's back that off. No, maybe we're not ultimately doing it for the customer, but we're ultimately doing it for society, right? This is our contribution. And remember, all of us make a contribution. All of us, in fact, make a contribution to society. Does it enrich society, or does it in fact maybe hinder society? So we're going to learn to do things as well as we can with the resources we have to provide the greatest level of benefit. In terms of productivity, and everyone's, bosses are interested in that. We've got to have productivity, right? Quality, customers are interested in that, but so are workers. Workers are amazingly interested in quality if they're given some opportunity to have some say-so about it. Why are workers interested in quality? Because it builds their self-esteem. If I turn out a high-quality product, then I can go home every day with pride in what I do. If I'm told to just slap it together and no one will notice, I'm being robbed of my esteem. I'm being robbed of my sense of self-efficacy. That is my ability to do something well, right? This is all in terms of minimizing costs to the greatest extent possible, but doing so in a way that doesn't hurt us, right? And then satisfaction, self-esteem, employee satisfaction, and note that all of these are likely going to lead to greater retention. Now, I read a frightening statistic this morning. If we look at the past administration, we got 4 years of past administration to look at, right? From 2017 to 2021, January, what do we find? Had a 91% turnover rate of the administration. 91%. That's unheard of. That means if you are hired on at the beginning of the administration, that 4 years is a 9 in 10 chance that you didn't make it to the end. There are actually 6, count them, 6 people, 6, I knew I could find it there somewhere, 6 people in the administration who started at the beginning and made it to the end. Think about that. That's crazy to think about. And what makes it even worse, 2 of them were relatives. So this is just a horrible example of the personnel selection process. So ultimately, it's the community that wins in this. And it's the community because if I like my job, I stay in my job, I'm retained in my job, my employment is consistent, it supports my family, right? And the community can count on us. And businesses within the community then become leaders rather than detractors from the community. So we interview candidates. That's what we try to do. We try to facilitate that fit through the interview process. And how many of you have gone through interviews, right? Unfortunately, interviews are notoriously unreliable. Hollingsworth demonstrated this in 1929 through a series of studies, right? What we're talking about overall in subsequent studies, that interviews have been found to be about 3% better than chance, which is like, why are we bothering with this shit at all? And again, think about it in terms of the self. I think, well, I know who would be good for this position, and I'm pretty clever, and I know people, so I can ask the right questions to determine whether someone's a good fit or not, because I'm awesome and bitchin'. To say that, well, I don't want to interview because I can be as easily fooled as the next person, and I think I know that I can judge people, but I'm sadly mistaken. Note that no one wants to admit that, right? So people still cling to interviews. I brought this up in our lectures meeting last Tuesday about interviews because they were talking about doing some interviews. And I said, you do realize those are no better than chance. And they said, well, yeah, it depends on who does them. And I'm like, no, but, and I just leave it alone at this point in time. And it becomes interesting because they're designing interviews for positions in the psychology department. No one has ever asked me, what do you think, Mark? Would you look across our hiring procedure? I mean, It's just silly, right? Is there a better way? Yeah. And I'm going to borrow here, you betcha, right? And one example is psychometric testing to the rescue. Psychometrics is the field of mental measurements, as an example. Psychometric tests are perhaps the best predictor of trainability and subsequent performance on the job, if we want to hire people who are trainable. Or maybe we want to hire people who already possess the requisite skills. And that's something that has to do with the business philosophy and something that we would talk about with the managers. And remember, managers and supervisors are our internal customers. So if I'm hiring people, I'm supplying managers or supervisors with workers. They are an internal customer. How do I guarantee their satisfaction? Well, I start de-emphasizing interviews and I start emphasizing tests that actually tell us something, that are valid and both reliable. And I keep throwing those terms around. We're going to look at those terms, believe me, in great detail later in the course. And I know you freaking can't wait. So think about this. After all, there's 11D2 tests available. It's a very big number indeed, according to my buddy Harl, that I met when I was in Northern California, finding myself working in the lumber mill. How do you know which test to use? And this is what we're going to talk about throughout Module 2, right? And perhaps more basically, what categories of tests, right? Rather than just the specific test, but let's what type of test do I need? And then I can get specific about this, the actual test, right? So job analysis is the study of what the job holder does on the job, what must be known in order to do it, what resources are used in doing the job, and perhaps the conditions under which the job is done. Now, I want to talk about the reality of job analysis here a little bit. When I found myself at Salem Converting, Boise Cascades paper mill in Salem, Oregon, and I worked there for 5 years, and then I was promoted, transferred to the Wallula mill in eastern Washington. But when I started at Salem, I started as a union worker, as did everyone. Everyone is a union worker, and you join the union, you pay your dues. And I used to bitch about the union, and I still might bitch about the union at times, for this, that, and the other reason. And I remember the union president, Tom Conzoner, and the vice president, Dick, and they both looked at me and said, "Mark, you spend an awful lot of time flapping your jaws about the union. You got a lot of shit to say about the union. Most of it's no good." I said, "Did you ever think of maybe shutting up and contributing? If you feel the union has so many problems, why don't you then volunteer for positions and or run for elected positions in the union?" And, they were right. It's like, yeah, I'm talking a big game, but so far I have contributed nothing, so maybe I need to change that. And at that point then I did. I ran for a union job. So I was one of the auditors on the union, and there's 3 of us that checked the books annually to see how the union money was being spent. It was a safeguard. But the job then that came available, and it was a appointed job rather than an elected job, was the job analysis rep. So I was job analysis for the local 467. That was our union designation of the Associated Pulp and Paper Workers. The APP, I don't even remember the designation anymore. And what did that mean? Well, if you're a packaging line operator, that job is defined. What does a packaging line operator do? Well, and then there's a whole list of functions, right? That is, the job has been analyzed. And it says these are the requirements for the job. This is what a packaging line operator does. And as a union member who is now bid into that progression line, that is, that's where you work, you've earned that job, and now you perform that job, you are expected to do these things. You're expected to operate these machines, you're expected to do these things, right? So there's a whole list of the resources you'll use, the machines you'll operate, the expectations surrounding production, right? This is kind of your world as a packaging line operator. But the deal is, what if the job changes? What if they bring in a new machine? What if they bring in a new machine to put on the packaging line that requires a higher level of skill to operate? Or what if they put in new machines that you operate and you increase production by 20%? Notice that the $15.18 an hour, which was base pay for a packaging line operator, which is pretty good pay for someone who likely has a high school diploma, right? No college necessary. That's pretty good pay. Comes with benefits, etc. But let's suppose that we change the requirements of the job, that the company changes the requirements of the job. Then it was up to me, the job analysis rep, to go before a board, a panel of folks from both paper mills, elected from paper mills, and elected from the union, and I would present a case. I would say, this job has changed. This job requires a higher level of skill. This job produces more paper. This job, etc. Whatever it was. And then I would say, because of the change of the nature in this job, then the pay should be adjusted to compensate for that. And I love this job. God, it was a cool job. Who wouldn't love this job? Because what you get to do is fight the best fight you can, provide the best evidence you can, a lot of statistical analysis, right, on production and quality, etc., to present to this governing body. And once you're done with your presentation, they say, okay, so excuse us, we're going to meet and we're going to discuss it. And then they call you back and say, you know what? You've made your case. We're going to take base pay for that job, $15.18, and because of your demonstration of higher levels of skill or knowledge or abilities needed, or that the job produces more as a result of these changes, the job is now pays more. So, you know, you go in, you argue a $15.18 job, and I say, look, this is what's happened. These people need to learn to do new things. They have additional skill sets, and they would come back and say, we're raising the pay to $15.36 an hour. Now, I know 18 cents an hour doesn't seem like much, but it's the only way you get a raise in this union environment is through the job analysis process. I loved it. And man, do you get to appear heroic or whatever? Because I would sit there and I would work with the people and I would find out what's different about their job. I would study the existing job analysis documents, see how it's changed, and then make a case supported by statistical evidence, do a decent presentation, and boom, people make more money. I did 9 job analyses while I was there for the 3 years that I was doing that, and out of the 9, got 8 jobs more money. And notice, when you get a job more money, that's more money for everyone who performs that job. So if there's, you know, on number 2 Will Sheeter, there's 2 packaging operators, but there's 4 shifts, so that's actually 8 packaging operators that are, you know, designated to do that job. Each one of them gets the raise, right? That's how it works. That's what the job pays. So I love doing that job. Now, I did fail at one, and let's talk about that one. That was a toughie. We had one janitor, right? And the janitor, of course, that was a union position as well. And their job had a job analysis. And he asked me, hey, Mark, since you're doing so well with all these job analyses, why don't you get me some more money? And I said, well, on what basis? You know, and we discussed it, and I would, you know, on my own time come in and hang out with him and run around with him and do his job, right, to better understand how he did his job and what was different. And I tried to provide the statistical evidence, but it was a hard sell. And basically it's centered around the janitor is now required to provide all these materials to service the machines that the operators use. And without the janitor, then the machines don't work as well or as efficiently, or the operators have to leave their machines to go get these products. So the janitor's crucial to keeping shit running, but it just didn't fly. And you know, I did my best, but you can't always win. I love that job. So what we're talking about here then is near and dear to my heart. I love this. I enjoy doing it. And note, if you were going to hire a teacher, to teach the personnel psychology course, right? Knowing how to do a job analysis might be one of the primary qualifications that you want that teacher to have experience in that field. right? So, not bragging or anything. That's not where I'm going with this, but I believe that I have the knowledge, skills, and ability, that is, having been a job analysis rep, one, having a tremendous background in statistics, right? Like 4 undergraduate statistics courses. I minored in graduate level statistics, right? The design courses in designing methods of measurement, etc., the exploration of validity and reliability through all my coursework. I come with a pretty high level of knowledge, skills, and ability to talk in this area. So I would probably represent an effective hire if we were going to, in fact. Now, notice, how did I actually get hired to teach this class? The department said, I remember Nygren calling me and he says, Org Psych seems to be going really well, Mark. And I said, yeah, because that's something I've interested in and played that game for years before I got to school. And they said, we got this other class, personnel psychology. Might you be interested in offering that maybe once a year? And I'm going, well, what is it? Yeah, and I go, yeah, of course, right? But that was basically the hiring criteria I fulfilled within the eyes of the department. So we got lucky, I guess, somehow. You be the ultimate judge of that, because you're going to sit with me for a couple more months. You might say, this guy is just a verbose loser. I hope I forget everything that I've heard from him. Or maybe not, right? So a little self-deprecating humor never hurts. Job analysis, what might it include? Well, it's going to probably include the job title and the grade. It's going to talk about key result areas, KRAs, and we love our acronyms, right? And this is, a key result area for a packaging line operator is getting cartons of paper going through the hole in the floor down the conveyor, all right, with the right labels, etc., and the right number. The workplace location might be critical to understanding this. One of the bitchin' things about working in a paper mill, at least during the winter time, when it's cold as hell in Salem, Oregon, and it gets cold as hell, or even colder in Wallula, Washington, in eastern Washington, paper mill's a bitchin' place to work. Because you walk in, if you're in the machine room with those machines, man, the humidity is controlled. Well, it's humid in the paper mill. Humidity is controlled in a converting plant, but it's warm. So, you dress like this once you get inside. Now, when I worked in construction in Oregon, that frickin' sucked. Because we worked in Oregon and Washington, we did jobs that's outside all winter long. You freeze your butt off. What I remember as much about anything as working in construction as a construction laborer, which is, where you start, is I would get to work and be expected to start working at 6 a.m. and by 6:30 a.m. I was cold and wet. And I would spend the rest of the day that way. So workplace location might be a critical factor, right, in understanding. Can someone bear the cold and the wet, etc.? Okay. What about working in Antarctica? That's crazy to think about. I remember when I first got to graduate school, I hadn't been in graduate school for more than 2 or 3 months, and Tetlock asked me, my advisor, he says, how would you feel about conducting a study in Antarctica? And I'm like, that would be an amazing opportunity of a lifetime, but I don't know if my wife and the rest of my graduate school education is on board with this. Thanks, but maybe no thanks. And you look back and say, wow, maybe I should have done that. I don't know. The hours and days of work. One of the critical aspects to consider in working at the paper mill is you work, the paper machines run 7 days a week, right? 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They shut down for 1 week in the year for maintenance, but that's it. Otherwise, the paper machine's running continuously. That means that some people got to work in the wee hours of the morning, some people work on weekends, some people work during the day, some people work swing shift, and the way that the paper industry decided to make that equitable in most cases is you work a rotating shift. So this week you work days, next week you work swing shift, the following week you work graveyard, and then you're back on day shift. And notice that your days off rotate. So you get 1 3-day weekend a month, right? But otherwise you're working weekends. It sucks. And you look at people who work at the paper mill, they look old. You look at this guy and you say, oh my God, you're still working. You look like you're 70 years old. And he goes, no, I'm 50, right? Because they don't get enough sleep. It sucks the life out of them. Holiday entitlement. Is there, right? Rates and method of pay. Job analysis may include all these factors. Who's the direct supervisor? To whom do you report, right? To whom are you responsible? And also maybe who's evaluating your behavior. Your relationship with other people in the workplace. It may or may not include this to the extent of how important it is. And other benefits might be spelled out. Now, what's the purpose? Better understanding of the nature of the job. Create an objective view of the task required for a job. It defines boundaries between jobs, and this becomes important. I remember one day at the paper mill, I was brand new there, and the supervisor came by and said, Ramon is at the dentist. They're finishing up his work, but he's going to be about an hour late. He called, so you guys just keep going. And Ramon, what he did, he was the material handler, and he brought us rolls of paper and lined them up and got them ready so we could put them into the machine. Well, Ramon didn't show up, right, for an hour, excused. So I went over. My packaging line is running itself. It didn't need me. It's just clicking away. So I went over and got on the grab truck, and this is something I've been trained to do because I was a material handler previously. I laid down a set of rolls. I cut the heads off the rolls and prepped them, and I was about 2/3 of the way through getting Ramon's stuff done so he wouldn't be behind when he got in. And one of our union people, shop steward, said, Mark, what are you doing? And I said, I'm just getting Ramon's shit done so that, in fact, when he comes in, he's not behind. And they said, don't do that. Put that knife down right now, paper knife, right? Put that down and go back to your packaging line. And I go, what's the deal? Just trying to help Ramon. And he says, if management sees you doing Ramon's job, then they may consider Ramon unnecessary, that the packaging line operators could do it and may eliminate his job. So I had crossed the boundary. I started doing a job that was not mine, and the union reinforced the idea that if we start taking on additional tasks, then they may determine that the person who normally performs those tasks becomes unnecessary. For better or for worse, defines the boundaries between jobs. It understands jobs, family, and progression ladders, right? And a progression ladder at the paper mill, you're a packaging machine operator on number 2, and then when you promote, you go to packaging machine operator on number 1. And then you go back to number 2, but you're the actual machine operator. And then finally, the pinnacle of that progression ladder is the number 1 machine operator, right? And it could take anywhere from, let's say, 10 to 25 years to ascend to the top level number 1 machine operator. Okay. Calculate pay rates for jobs. We talked a little bit about that already. And can provide a legal defense of a selection process. And this is going to be critical, and we'll discuss this at some length. Okay, let's never forget the legal defense, and this is why a valid job analysis is some of the best legal protection we can have in a hiring context. So, potential uses then, determine the job requirements and the characteristics. Other benefits can include training program development. And that is, if we have good job analysis and we have progression ladders, it can inform how people need to be trained as they progress through those ladders. Or what's a logical next step, a promotion step for many people, and what knowledge, skills, and abilities do I have to develop from job 1 to then be a candidate for job 2. Notice that we can build training programs so that in-house we can begin to increase the skill sets in our people and facilitate their promotion paths. Okay. Now, organizational design tells us what we can do in terms of which jobs, right, and how we're going to handle it. The job, graduate, grading, ranking, compensation is another facet of job analysis. The employee development. So we can begin to think in terms of progression through various steps and what makes sense, but also what qualifies a person to be promoted. And note that a core idea in this class, guys, we're talking about the Peter Principle. That's our required book. And the Peter Principle describes a situation where people are promoted beyond their capabilities. Right? And obviously job analysis was not well connected in the examples we're going to see within the Peter Principle. It can assist continuous improvement efforts by providing measurement criteria. And that is, we can begin to measure how the job is done and we can measure improvements in the job that are the result of our changes in hiring practice, improvement in hiring practice, changes in our developmental systems, right, and our training systems. So to be able to quantify what's done in a job becomes amazingly important in this context. It can potentially support dismissal or demotion process, right? That is, and my wife was just talking to me about, an attorney who doesn't seem to be pulling their weight. If there's a strong job analysis and measurable performance criteria, at some point we can demonstrate, look, this is the job analysis and this is what the person was hired to do, but they're falling short in all these areas. And we can quantify, we can demonstrate how they're falling short, and it really is empirically based. And then this justifies a dismissal process. That can also help to avoid lawsuits. Or even if we're not firing the person, we can say, look, this is what the job requires, but your measurable qualities are not up to that. So, something has happened where you've fallen behind, or you're not pulling your weight, carrying your share of the water, however you want to put that, and then you can, in fact, design interventions. So we're going to have to see this over the next couple weeks, and we might need you to participate in additional training, and we're going to allow you then to demonstrate the improvement in your performance. So a big numbers fan, right? And I also want to kind of do a good assignment this semester. It's not been well done in the past. That's my fault. In both retention and dismissal ideas. So look for that at the end of the course. But ultimately, we want to avoid the Peter Principle outcomes. That is, we want to not just kick people upstairs because they've been around since time began. So, to meet legal requirements, job analysis must be valid and identify the worker's knowledge, skills, abilities, KSAs, and other characteristics. So it used to be KSAs, but other characteristics became important, in that cluster of ideas, so it's now KSAOs. Right? Necessary to perform the job and differentiate superior from barely acceptable workers. And here is, you may support this idea or not, but a lot of what we're talking about is rank ordering people. And we're talking rank ordering people either on the basis of observable performance in a job or rank ordering people on tests that would tend to indicate superior performance on the job. But it is about rank ordering. And so, that's kind of at the core. What we're ultimately saying is this person provides a better fit, brings more to the party than this other person, right? Either promotion, retention, or what we're really talking about right now is hiring. We want the job analysis to be in writing and relevant to the particular job in question, right? And that's just kind of, a valid job analysis. Ultimately, it should be derived from multiple sources. And many of us in psychology have been trained in psychology, who've been trained as experimental researchers, right? So I'm an experimental social psychologist. We often bring people into the laboratory, but we want to measure the observed behavior, right? Or if we're doing the non-conscious stuff, right, the implicit underpinnings of that behavior, we want to measure it in multiple ways. And the beauty is, if we can measure, if we do 3 measures, and this measure says yes, this measure says supports that measure, and this measure supports, then the validity is less in question, right? So we love multiple measures to the extent as possible. So, as a human resources professional, if you're involved in job analysis, right, or as a union professional, if you're involved in job analysis, you got to plan the job analysis. Now, for me at the paper mill, it was pretty straightforward, right? I was a team of one in this respect. I work with the people, and I just determine, kind of by the seat of my pants, always trying to figure out how I represent what they do accurately, fairly, and in a way that provides them more money, ultimately. But determine the time and resources necessary and available. That is, if someone says, look, we're going to need 3 people, and we'd like to put them in place next year, This is in a perfect world where you get all this crazy ass lead time from your bosses. And they say, we'd like you to start cooking up a job analysis and present us, make presentations in the interim, like every quarter, so that we are satisfied with what we're going to do. All right? Now, one thing you're going to need to do is collect background information about the company, its culture, its business strategy, and that's why we talk business strategies. If this is a company that uses people like toilet paper, it merely employs them and then throws them away, then don't expect a large budget for job analysis, right? Or for one to be done at all, or to have it be done in the most cursory fashion. Now, if it's a company that values people, looks at people as resources, but also resources that can be improved over time, then job analysis becomes increasingly important, right? So that we have more factors on which to base our decisions. So when I got my job at the lumber mill, for example, right? It was a failed move. I moved to Northern California. I didn't really figure out that I was not qualified to work in a winery. No wineries would hire me. So what do I end up doing? Well, rather than starve to death, right, or have my family starve to death, what did I do? I went to a temporary agency, Kelly Light Industrial. So Kelly used to do the secretarial stuff, right? Well, they branched out into light industrial. I got a back, I got a couple muscles, I can at least do something, right? But the nice thing about Kelly is you're employed immediately. So you go sign up with Kelly, they say you're good to go, they'll call you maybe the next day with work, and that's how I ended up at the lumber mill. They said, hey, there's a opening for a laborer at the lumber mill, right? And I'm going, where is that? And they gave me the address, and I said, oh my God, that's only like 3 miles from here. That's ideal. And it paid like, I don't know, something ridiculous, like $8 an hour or whatever there was. It wasn't horrible, it wasn't great, but at least it was a job. And I got in and I started working. And what they did is, as I started working, the boss there thought I was a good worker and they needed someone, so they hired me away from Kelly. Now, they're not supposed to do that, but that's how it happened. But notice, they were not planning on hiring someone. They wanted a short-term hire in which they had to invest no money. Now, the downside is that Kelly gets a cut, so they're paying Kelly like $12 for me, and Kelly's giving me like $8 or $8.50, right? And that's Kelly's fee in there. So eventually, they just hired me, but that was cool. Now, when we look, and I'm going to have you go to ONET, right? And here it is. It's the Occupational Information Network. We have just this amazing resource of job analysis already. So we're going to explore ONET. We're going to move through it. So this is one way that we can collect information about the job, is go straight to ONET, plug in the job, look at the job families, and it will give us knowledge, skill, ability. It gives us long-ass lists of KSAOs. Right, and all the information we could want about a job. Now, another thing that planning job analysis is, we need to identify job experts. So if the number one will sheeter operator, if those 3 guys that hold that position ask for me to do a job analysis, right, I have to say, well, who am I going to talk to? Who do I need to talk to study this job? Well, that's a slam dunk. I talk to them, right? But it may be trickier in different contexts. And then we have to identify the appropriate job analysis techniques to use. And that's what this lecture is going to be about, guys. It's about the techniques. So, job analysis steps, typical. Notice that it could deviate from this. Okay, so what we need to do, let's get the support of top managers, ensure all managers support the job analysis effort. If people want to put the brakes on it, they feel it's unimportant, they feel it's unnecessary, then they may limit your access to the people you need to talk to. They may limit your access to the records you need, maybe production records or quality records. So really, the managers have to be on board, and you have to be seen as someone who is working with and for them, rather than perhaps working against them. All right? You got to thoroughly communicate the job analysis to all participants, ensure they're diligent about completing the tasks objectively. And when I show up to do a job analysis, and I got my clipboard and I got my pencil, and God forbid I bring a stopwatch, Then I look at like one of these people in the 1930s through the 1950s that was called an efficiency expert. And these people came in and they observed jobs, and it was almost ultimately their goal was to eliminate jobs that didn't need to be done. So the efficiency expert was feared and despised. Well, note, for a job analysis rep, right, someone conducting a job analysis might be the same thing. Well, why are you doing this? Why are you studying this job? Why are you measuring this? Why are you asking me all these questions? Are you going to eliminate my job? Is that what this is all for? And people can get really, really kind of suspicious about this. So honest, open, clear communication, and to the extent that the company has a good rapport with the worker, then this is easier to do. If it's been kind of an adversarial relationship between workers and management, then it becomes increasingly difficult. Okay? So, collect background information, analyze how the job contributes to the execution of the firm's business strategy. So, what exactly is taking place and what is the relationship of this job to the big picture for the business? Then start generating task statements. What does the person do? What does the job holder do in this position? Right? And then from the tasks, then you can say, okay, these are the tasks. What knowledge, skills, ability, or other characteristics support performance of these tasks? So we're translating what we observe, right, and what historic records show us to qualities that feed to that, right? So form the job, duty, and task groupings. Link the KSAOs back to the job duties, right? So what you're doing is kind of drawing this big matrix to say, hey, these are the tasks, these are the KSAs, and these are how the KSAs support them, right? Collect critical incidents. And this is what represents enormous failure or what represents enormous success. And how does this deviate from the standard or average performance? More on critical incidents later. Fascinating idea. Weight the job duties. So how much time does one, and time is often the metric here, how much time does someone spend doing this? How much time does someone spend on this task? How much time spend on this task, right? To kind of prioritize. Construct a job requirement matrix. More on that later, right? And then write the job description and person specifications. So the job description says this is what's done, and this is what the applicant should be able to do that qualifies them for the job. So how's it done? and the total simple answer to this is, hey, you could just, one technique, right? And now we got to talk some techniques, is you could just ask people what they do. What do you do? What do you do? And this is like what I did with the janitor. What do you do? I've never performed your job, Mr. Janitor, so what do you do? And I realize you drive a forklift, because we're doing that. You haul around the big carts to collect all the trash, and you do that, right? You work in the storeroom where all the products that someone would use, like silicone spray or grease guns or any of these objects, you know, that people might use, right? Among other things. So I just wander around and start making a list. Now notice, I also, if it was available when I was doing the job, it wasn't, but then I could consult ONET or other sources and say, what does ONET say this job does, and what am I seeing in reality? How do they match up? Multiple sources are always better. So we discuss the job. Now, we can observe and perform. More on that. We keep excellent written records. We use quantitative methods wherever possible. We want to convert opinion to data, right? That is numbers. So, discussing the job at the individual level. What does this mean? Oh, individual interviews. So we use interviews with multiple incumbents. Now, the term incumbent is people who do the job. So, when you hear incumbent, it's the person who's doing the job, right? So it's like the person who's in political office currently is the incumbent, right? So we can do individual interviews, using interviews with multiple incumbents. Now, one thing for sure is, okay, so if I'm going to interview these people, I better have a pre-prepared interview, right? And I'm going to give the same interview to everybody, right? And I'm going to find a way to record their responses that is reliable and consistent across conversation with everybody. So, the nice thing about being able to interview multiple incumbents is it elicits multiple views of what the job entails. And that is, some people might not even think about some aspect of the job they perform. It's become so routinized that they don't even consider it, right? So the more people that you can interview, the richer the picture, the more diverse picture you have of what it means to do that job. But on the other hand, no, this costs money. Your time is worth money when you're doing this job. So is their time, right? Especially if you're bringing people in on overtime to interview them. And if you're in a place where, employees are hourly and they're busy, so you can't interview them while they're working, you say, can you stay a couple hours after work, right? Because I need to interview you for the purposes of job analysis. They're being paid overtime at that time. And depending on the contract, at the paper mill, we were time and a half for the first 8 hours in a week. And then if we work 8 hours overtime within a week, after 8 hours of overtime, then we're paid double time for our overtime. And believe it or not, that could accrue pretty quickly at the paper mill. That was one of kind of the advantages. Okay, but it's very time consuming, right? Because we're interviewing each person separately. But there might be a desire to interview people separately, right? Then interview them together. It can be very subjective because people are telling you, maybe they're explaining to you objectively what they do, but maybe they want to appear more important than they actually are, so they're kind of inflating what they do. And they're describing things like they do all these things, when actually those are very rare tasks, maybe not done at all, or done in a very limited fashion. What is actually being done may not be the same as what is being reported as being done. And we have to keep an eye on that. And this is where multiple techniques come in, because in a perfect world, what I might do then is interview people and create this task list of all the things they do. But then I might go back later and just actually observe people at work and then see what they actually do compared to what they said they do. And that depends on the nature of your organization and the people you're discussing it with. So let's start talking about doing job analysis for a homework assignment. This is homework 4. And notice, this is going to be multi-step. So throughout this whole lecture, I'm going to be presenting subtasks within homework 4. So a couple of things. For the list of jobs supplied, which technique is best employed for each job? Be prepared to explain why you selected is appropriate. The technique you selected is appropriate to gathering the job analysis information. So, believe it or not, you're going to have a team leader for this assignment. Maybe you want it for the whole class. I don't know. But they're going to have to contact me, and I'm going to send you a job list. And what I'm going to do is send you a list of like 10 jobs. And from that list of 10 jobs, right, or maybe I should just post it, I don't know, we'll get to that. But you get that list. Once you have that list of jobs, what I want you to do is you pick one technique and match it to a job. Pick a different technique and match it to a job. So I'm going to provide you with a wide variety of jobs. Some techniques are better for some jobs than others. So part of your thinking and your learning process in this is to match technique to job, right? And explain your rationale for so doing. And I'm going to ask you during this assignment, don't duplicate jobs. One technique per job, so you just start crossing them off your list. So, discussing the job. Discussing the job at the individual level is what I just described. Design an interview for an incumbent for the job of blank, and this would be like your assignment template. So you're going to say, hey, this is the job, this is, and so you're going to fill out A, B, and C. Now for number 1, number 2, and number 3 on this assignment, A, B, and C all need to be done as they're appropriate. Okay, so homework number 4, 1, part A. For each of the 3 techniques above, clearly describe who, what, where, when, why, how, and apply your decisions. Your chosen technique is used to elicit this information. You're trying to paint a picture of the job's major aspects, both good and bad, right? If I were working as Snow White at Disney World, what is it I'd do? with whom, to what effect. So you kind of get how that works out? Notice, what do I do, to whom, and what is the ultimate result? That would be the key result area that we described earlier. Under what conditions do I do it? Where and when, right? And those may or be more important. So, what I'm doing for, and number one is an individual interview, right? So, hold on. So, now, 1B, design a worksheet for collecting information you acquire. Remember our discussions of record keeping? Well, this is super important. If faced with a lawsuit, one of the building blocks of your defense is a well-prepared job analysis. And one thing they might ask you in court is, how did you prepare this job analysis? And you'll say, well, initially what I did was individual interviews with Snow White incumbents, because I felt that they knew more about the job than just about anyone else. So the initial job analysis was done using the individual interview method, using the incumbent Snow Whites, right? Because there's probably more than one in a lot of organizations. You know, you think there's a Snow White at Disneyland. I guarantee you there's more than one Snow White, right? So, additionally, a pre-prepared worksheet allows people on your team to collect job analysis in a consistent and reliable manner. So what you want to use is a worksheet. So you want to develop this. And at the top of the worksheet, it's going to say job being analyzed. And then it's going to say, when did the analysis take place? Who was analyzed, right? What method was employed? So individual interview. So you're going to go on down the list here, right? And check all these boxes. You're going to fill in all this data. One thing that you need to get used to is developing worksheets, because the idea is that you might be the human resources manager that's designing the job analysis and you're going to have other people conduct it. You might, if it's a big organization, or maybe the organization is operating multiple facilities, you might want the analysis conducted on the East Coast and the West Coast facility by different people. So by supplying a pre-prepared worksheet, you increase the likelihood that you'll get data that's consistent from both sources. Nothing sucks worse than to have two different groups conduct job analysis and provide you with information that looks entirely different, that is not even the same information or information categories. So best to design worksheets for people to use. So your first attempt at a worksheet is unlikely to be perfect. That's okay. Continuous improvement, it's the bomb, right? And we can look forward to doing it better in future iterations. If you look at assignments I wrote last year, right, the year before, it's pretty obvious they're improving in quality over time. At least I like to think so. And then discuss the pros and cons for each technique. How your knowledge of these pros and cons guided your selection of this particular job and matched it to this particular technique. And the lecture should be a big help here. I'm going to discuss theoretical pros and cons to each technique, right? So this is your opportunity to apply them to the actual job. So I want to move back here, right? So, using individual interviews, pro, right? Well, it does get us a good level of detail on the job, perhaps. Con, it could be subjective, right? Another con, something else could be different, you know, being reported as different than what is actually done. But consider that the person closest to the job is the person conducting the job, doing the job, so that would be a pro. So move on through these. Now, let's look at, then jump forward. What's our next technique? And I think that, you know, this lecture is better consumed in its entirety, right? And then once everyone on your team has consumed this lecture in its entirety, then you can go back, you can look at the assignment, and you can begin to understand the big picture of the assignment, and you can begin to apportion, split up the work between you guys. I really want teams to do all of the elements in here, figure out how to split it equitably between the 4 or 5 of you, how many ever people are on your team. Now, discussing the job within groups. Now you can do group interviews. And now what we could do is, if there's enough incumbents, we can bring them in simultaneously, and we can say, hey, let's then discuss the job. Now, one of the benefits to doing it with a group rather than with individuals is you might capitalize on what's called a synergy effect. And this may provide richer description than individual interviews. And what it does is it allows people to piggyback. They say, well, I do this. But they say, yeah, we do that. But you know what? Now that you said that, we actually also do this. So you get this interaction, which could be valuable, right? And you might get more information than you would with an individual interview. Note, another pro to this is it takes less time than individual interviews because I can interview, let's say, 5 people during this hour rather than do 5 one-hour individual interviews. Right? But one of the cons, most likely a con, is group dynamics can now be a factor. That is, there will be certain people who are more vocal than others. So they may, in fact, distort what is done because the most vocal people might, in fact, then paint the most detailed picture, right, and the less vocal people might not chime in. So this can also be very subjective. These people may, in fact, then be almost bragging in front of each other and really kind of padding the tasks that they do. And again, another con, that's the same with the individual interviews, what they're saying they do might not be the same as what's actually done. So, the presence of others may inhibit revealing details that some job holders would prefer to remain hidden. So, ultimately, I know we're supposed to do this, but we don't really do this. We actually do it this way, and we don't do that at all. People might not fess up, if you're working with individuals, often, you build up a rapport with an individual. If you're going to spend the day with them doing their job, right, they let their guard down, they start admitting certain factors. That's maybe unlikely to happen in a group interview, or less likely to happen. So, now, for C, this is homework number 4, number 2, right? Number 1 was individual interview technique. Now we're at number 2 is group interview technique. Design a discussion template for the 5 job holders of the job of blank. So you want to be pre-prepared to lead the discussion. Like, what are 5 tasks that you perform? What are tasks that you perform on a daily basis? So you want some kind of script going in, right? So you can see that the assignment is layered. You got 1, 2, and 3, all requiring A, B, and C, right? So 9 elements in total, if you will. I would read ahead again. I would watch the lecture, go all the way through it, get the big picture, and then go back, look specifically at the assignment, and start dividing your work up like that, right? And you can see that I think it's important that we learn to use all these techniques. So if we say, well, there's only 5 people on my team and not 6, or whatever, you still need to learn to use the technique, right? So we might just have to buckle down and work hard in that regard. So, let us then talk the third element, discussing the job, and this is expertise driven. And we get a new acronym, because I know you haven't had enough yet, and this is subject matter experts. So these are people who have somehow demonstrated their expertise in a given area. Notice the acronym is sweet, SMEs. So the SMEs, it sounds almost like it came from the Smurfs, right? This can be quite efficient when you use subject matter experts. It's useful when there are no incumbents, especially if you're thinking about adding some element to your organization that's going to require brand new staffing. You might not have any existing incumbents. You might be branching into a new area. So you'll then look to SMEs, that is, people who are, for whatever reason, thought to be subject matter experts. It's very legally defensible because you can say, well, these are subject matter experts, and to the extent that you can demonstrate that they are, then the legal defensibility increases. It can be less subjective because they're not actually performing the job necessarily. They are experts on the job, right? Less potential for intentional distortion as a result of this. So you can see I'm listing out some of the pros, and remember, that's something that you're going to have to discuss in the assignment of the pros. But, and the cons might be, to what extent are they really experts? I mean, they might know a lot about the job, but do they actually do the job? And I've said before, earlier, that, the people who do the job are the experts on the job. So these are more not experts on the job, but experts about the job, if you'll allow for that little prepositional nuance there. Mixed bag. But again, The idea is that we learn all the techniques and then we determine which technique is most applicable to our situation. And again, that's something that you're going to talk about in your assignment. So, this derogatory that a well-functioning organization, the individual performing the job would be a subject matter expert. That's what I would maintain. But there could be reasons, or like I said, new business, new department, some new wrinkle in what we're doing might then necessitate this. Let's suppose that you operated a brewery, right? And you know, there's a lot of local breweries around here, like Columbus Brewing Company is just up the street from me. I think they make great beer, right? They got some India Pale Ales that are, I think, just top notch. And they want to open up a room. They want to open up a tasting room, if you will. And maybe they want to serve food, or maybe they're going to sell merchandise. No, what you have existing is a bunch of people who know how to make beer, who know how to bottle beer, who know how to transport beer, but they don't really necessarily have anyone who can do face-to-face sales of beer, operate a cash register, stock merchandise, and all these other skills. So subject matter experts might be better if you're trying to build something from the ground up, like a new tasting room for your brewery. So, number 4 then, discussing the job. Subject matter experts, SMEs for the job of blank. So you're going to pick the job out of your list of jobs, and then you're going to say, hey, we did the SME thing because of this. You're going to answer A, B, and C for number 3 as well. Now, time to shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about observing and performing the job. I've already talked a little bit about observing the job, right? And a rich amount of information is generally available here. And it's less subject to intentional distortion because you're viewing, and let's face it, you're not an incumbent. You're not someone looking for a raise or trying to prevent their job from being eliminated. So observation can be, you know, a relatively objective way to go. It can be time intensive, right? And you may not observe normal performance. Remember when people in General Electric were observed, this is a study back in the 1930s, performance was better, but you know, what they then came to understand is people perform better because we were observing them. That is, we were paying attention to them, and that caused people to perform at a higher level. So you may not observe normal performance, and that's something that you have to, in fact, kind of consider. You might observe a higher conformance to procedural specifications. That is, people might employ shortcuts when they're not being observed, but then will do it by the letter when they are being observed. It may affect performance for a variety of reasons. It could be social facilitation effects. If you're watching someone who performs a job regularly and they're well rehearsed, then social facilitation predicts that they will perform even better. But if you're performing someone who's relatively new and tentative at the job, you'll usually see a performance decrement due to social facilitation effect. You might then provide a distraction, right? And this could then engender the ideas behind distraction conflict theory, that people perform more poorly because they're distracted from the task in being observed. There might be general attitude effects, and this might be that people don't like to be observed, so they resent it, and this might affect their performance as well. These are all, you know, possible elements of this. Now, I have done the observing the job through both job analysis, but I think the example I want to use is when I got to the Wallula mill to train to become the tech rep. They transferred me to the Wallula mill really before they had a job for me. So for a couple months it was kind of like, you need to find stuff to do to keep yourself busy and kind of justify the money we're paying for you until we get all our ducks in a row. And one of the decisions I made with my boss then, Chuck, who I was going to replace as the tech rep, he said, well, Mr. Flowcharter, you're Mr. Flowcharter, you know how to flowchart everything. I'd like you to flowchart some critical jobs here for either training purposes or replacement purposes. And he said the most critical job we have is performed by Carol Alt. And I said, what does she do? And she says, she trims the paper machine. And it's like, well, you know, I'm pretty new. And I'm like, I don't want to look stupid, so I'm not going to ask necessarily what that means, because I figure if I talk long enough, he'll explain. And what trimming the paper machine means simply is the paper machine develops what's called a reel of paper. And a paper machine runs continuously. It never stops. So it creates this reel, and then when the reel's full, it automatically puts in a new spindle that starts a new reel. Automatically, the machine never stops. It's crazy to watch that element of it. But the reel of paper for this paper machine was about 18 feet wide and probably about 8 feet in diameter. Can you imagine? That's a shit ton of copy paper when you think about it. 18-foot reel by 8 foot in diameter, right? Well, you can't even get it out of the building like that. So what you have to do is you take it to a machine that's called a rewinder, and what the rewinder does is allow you to wind that paper onto smaller rolls. So two things happen. You're going to reduce the roll in diameter to a maximum of, let's say, 60 inches in diameter, and no more than 86 inches wide. So you can imagine, wow, there's a lot of rolls that can be cut out of a reel. The idea is, how do we know what size to cut the rolls? And it's based on customer orders. So Carol's job in trimming the paper machine was to take this tremendous influx of orders for paper. And some people want the paper on 3-inch cores because they run printing presses. Other people want the roll paper on 5-inch cores because they use it bigger rolls to remanufacture like copy paper. So there's all these different customer needs. Some customers only want rolls this wide. Other customers can take rolls this wide. But the idea is, how do we cut all these rolls out of a reel and be most efficient with the least amount of waste? Because you don't make a lot of money on paper. It's a razor thin profit margin. It's a commodity. So the efficiency of trimming the paper machine, that is filling the orders from the reel, is all important. So Chuck said, here's a challenge for you, Mark. Why don't you sit down with Carol, who trims our paper machine, and flowchart the process? And I'm thinking ahead, and my good buddy was a programmer at the mill, and I said, you know, it's possible if we flowchart this well, that once we get it flowcharted and we super understand the process, we could probably develop a computer program to just trim. We could just input the orders, and the computer program would try all these different combinations and then ultimately decide on the trim pattern for a given reel. Or like, oh my God, that could be so cool. So I sat down with Carol, pulled up a chair next to her desk, and we became good friends as a result of this. And I said, so Carol, you know, essentially you're gonna learn me to you're gonna teach me to trim this paper machine. I'm gonna learn, and I'm gonna develop a flowchart that could, you know, ultimately spell this out or be used to train other people. I didn't talk too much about maybe developing a computer program to eliminate the job, because people don't want to necessarily hear that. Well, I'll tell you what, after 3 weeks of working with Carol, I felt I was no closer to developing a workable system of flowcharts than when we began. The process was so effing complex, it was ridiculous. Most of what has happened is Carol's been doing this for 25 years. And she's learned all these little tricks and all these little nuances and all these little techniques to maximize the output over time. Literally, she makes hundreds of implicit decisions regarding each reel based on the orders. And it's like pulling all that out. So in observing her, right, it was like, you know, I said, and I'm always like stopping her, drove her crazy, because I'm like, why did you do that? What was the decision there, right? And I'm, you know, doing my flow chart not on a computer but pencil and paper, because I'm erasing more than I'm writing, you know, but continually asking her, and it was cool for her and it was cool for me, because she didn't realize all the things, all the decisions she made, because it became automatic and habitual, so she didn't even think about it, and it was a fascinating but difficult task. So observing the job can be super simple. That is, if we go into McDonald's and observe what the fry chef does, it's probably going to be relatively straightforward and produce very little documentation, because there isn't a lot to the job. Trimming the paper machine, on the other hand, was an amazing endeavor. And we went out for about a month and a half, right? And it ultimately became part of the training process for Carol's replacement. We never did relegate it to being automated, being computerized at that point in time. And you'll find that you think, well, that's a big deal and that's a lot of money. How come someone didn't write a program for that? And it's like, there aren't that many paper mills. And you know, how many programmers are out there, and who's going to pay a programmer to develop the program necessarily? You know, a lot of times these are kind of one-up processes, so you really have to do them yourself. So we observed the job and developed a rich amount of information, and Carol was not intending to distort anything, and there were no distortions. It's a good technique, but it's amazingly time-consuming. If you consider that at this point in time, they had me at relief supervisor pay because I was no longer hourly, but they wanted to make that equivalent. They're paying me $18.35 an hour, and I was into it for a month and a half. And not really generating the end product in that amount of time. So it was a huge amount of time spent on that. And it's costly. So these are things to consider, because remember, you know, I bring up costs now and again, but you'll probably likely, as a human resources professional, have a budget. And you might be required to do job analysis for 6 different positions over the course of a year. What is your budget for doing that? And this is something that we have to consider. So a lot of times there's trade-offs. You know, it's like, I'd love to do it this way, but that's going to be too expensive. I'm going to have to accept rather incomplete results by doing it another way, right? Is it good enough? And who makes the call, is it good enough? And that gets back to the culture of your organization. So observing the job, this is homework 4, right? And this is now set, we're up to section B. So we already did A, 1, 2, 3. In this section, we explore, apply the techniques of observing and performing. So you're going to return to your job list, carefully consider the potential benefits of good technique to the job. What does that fit? Remember, because you always have to justify that in this course. I chose this technique because I believe, boom. So we're looking at the quality of your thought process in this assignment. There is a single right or wrong answer. There's not even anything approaching a single right or wrong answer. But the quality of your thought, the ability for you to apply these concepts to your real world problem, you know, as represented in the assignment. Strict evaluation of right or wrong, pretty subjective. Your course assistant and I are not going to be so much there. We're looking for the quality of work and the amount of effort you've put into it. Maybe it's best considered worse, better or worse, right, than right or wrong. And that's often the way of the world. So, number 4 then, what's it going to look like? Observing the job. What are you going to observe? Over what period of time? With how many participants and what set of circumstances? So you go into this with a plan. You just don't say, I'm going to go observe a job and then march in. It's like, I'm going to observe this job. This is what I'm going to look for. And you create yourself, again, a script of sorts that guides you through the process. So how many participants are you going to observe, right? And I actually observed 2. Carol normally did this, but anytime Carol was on vacation, then Cheryl would take her place, right? And Cheryl was not necessarily as good, but she did a few things that are a little different, trimming the paper of the machine, that should have been captured in the job analysis, and that was my attempt to do that. So, what period of time? Core job characteristics versus all functions in detail. So think about, here's a list of details, but there's going to be some core aspects. And one of the core aspects is to what extent, and this is also a key result area, if you will, to what extent does Carol maximize the trimming procedure and minimizing waste? And that's a core job characteristic, right? And even waste in this context is what happens to the waste in the trimming process. Well, the waste is recycled and it's beaten up and added back to the pulp to make more paper. So waste is a subjective term. You don't necessarily waste the material, but you do waste the energy that was used to make the paper in the first place. And how and why are these decisions made? Okay. So observing and performing, let's do the second half then, is performing the job. Rich amount of information in performing the job. Less subject to intentional distortion because we're hands-on at this point. It is time intensive though. Think about it, because now we are actually doing the job, and if, let's say, there are 8 major tasks in this job, but those tasks will only be guaranteed to be performed, each one of them, all 8 of them, over a 3-day period, then if you're performing the job, you're going to be performing it for 3-day periods so that you capture all those tasks. If this is, let's say, an administrative job that produces weekly and monthly reports, you can see that you might have to keep returning to augment your analysis based on the time of the month. So it's time intensive. It's appropriate, I think, for simpler jobs that require less training. Let's say that you want to write a job analysis for surgeon. I'm going to say that if surgeon is on the list of jobs I gave you, if you come back at me and say, hey, for the job analysis of surgeon, we chose perform in the job, not right or wrong, but I'm going to say better or worse. I'm going to say that is probably about the worst technique you can use, right? Performing the job, because if you're a surgeon, you have literally years of training and practice. We can't go in as human resources professionals and say, I'm going to perform surgeries for the next week, right, to better understand the job. It's just not in the realm of possibility, right? And notice that if we're looking at even simple jobs at the paper mill, you know, you got guys that drive the forklift, and that's a relatively simple job, but it does take training and it does take skill. But the guys who operate the roll grabs, that is not the forklift, but the forklift-looking machine that has big jaws on it, right? They have to pick up 8,000-pound rolls of paper, and they got to move them about. And then the crazy thing is, then they have to rotate them, and they have to set them down carefully, right? And if you don't do that correctly, man, you watch this, it's crazy. See an 8,000-pound roll of paper set down incorrectly. They open the jaws, and it just rolls, man, and there's nothing that stops that shit. So you don't want someone who's untrained performing that job, even for the purposes of a job analysis, right? Perform the job of police officer? No, I don't think so. That's something you will observe. You'll talk to SMEs, or you'll do individual or group interviews, right? But performing it is probably not appropriate. So it may fail to capture nuances of behavior performance because you're performing the job. You may not then turn the highest quality effort or have the finest attention to details. So you can see that observing performing is pretty limited in certain respects, right? Now, it can't be used, right? You can't be used it when there could be concerns of safety problems. Okay, so, and then when you get to homework 4, part B, right? Number 5 is performing the job. Why this choice of technique rather than observing the job? So that's something I want to hear from you. I want that explained. What are the pros and cons? What are the caveats? Oops, got to watch for this. What will you do? And is it the core characteristics versus all job functions in detail, and why? Now, what we may see is, note that techniques in the real world can then be combined. We may observe, and then certain aspects of the job we might actually try to perform. Or we might interview and then decide on the basis of the interview that there are some aspects of the job that we might want to perform to augment our job analysis. Multiple methods usually produce superior outcomes. Now, another technique, right, another tool in our potential toolkit is to have people keep a diary of what they do. Right? So incumbents keep a log of their activities. It's flexible and it's simple, right? But inconsistent level of detail is possible. So if you say, hey, you come to us lecturers and say, well, we want you to keep a diary of all the things you do in performing your job as lecturer, right? Well, some of us might be incredibly detailed. Some of us might just record the job in more general, broad strokes. So what's important to understand then is when you get these diaries back from, let's say, the incumbents, all right, you look and the detail might not match up, and you have to be pretty prepared to kind of to understand that. So they may fail to capture all the details consistently. It's time consuming to do, and if you're asking workers to do this, if they're already busy, I'm not looking for extra work. So if someone said, hey, we need you to keep a diary of your work, my first response might be, like, I don't have a frickin' enough to do. I'm not going to play or participate, right? Or if I am forced to participate, then I might provide a low quality diary because I'm not on board. So you got to sell these things, and you got to sell them the purpose of these things that you want people to engage in. It might be time consuming to assess. Imagine going through this and then coding it to what you ultimately want to find out. It may be difficult to analyze. So the diary method, advantages, disadvantages again. Create a diary template for the job of blank. So you choose your job that you're going to match to diary, right? And then how do you decide on the level of detail? And notice that you might actually want to develop a form that people fill out. It might be based on time. It might be 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. What are the things that you did? You might want to orient it that way. You might say, hey, just list each task that you perform in this day. You might ask then to assign how much time was spent on that task, right? So the diary method, cool, useful, and probably best used with some other technique, in conjunction with some other technique. Now, let's talk a little quantitative methodology. Task lists. This is simply incumbents list the tasks that they perform. The more incumbents, the more complete the lists. Pretty cool like that, right? Makes sense. They're relatively easy to analyze. At best, someone might use different names for a task or approach tasks from different angles, and you say, well, that's actually the same thing, so you might have to collapse those with each other. One group, and this is when we get fancy, might be used to create a task list, and then use a second group of different people, right, that take that task list that's been turned into a checklist, and they can then check off the tasks that they actually perform. So one group says, hey, these are the tasks we perform, and then you give a checklist from that task list that you created to a new group and say, hey, during the course of the day, I want you to check off each one of these tasks that you perform. It's a good way to verify the original task list, right? This is a tried and true laboratory technique as well. We often develop questionnaires by first giving one group of participants open-ended, hey, what are all the feelings that you might experience under this situation, right? And then later, in an experimental group, what we do is then create a task list. Which of these did you experience, right? So, checklists, right? Task list to checklist is the process I'm talking about there. List of tasks the incumbents check off. Probably easier to quantify in this regard. And a large number of incumbents, when you go to a checklist, right, it's faster, it's easier for them to use, so you might then, and it's faster to analyze, might use a larger number of incumbents. So, need to make sure, though, when you're using that task list as a checklist, that all the tasks are, in fact, included. So, notice that these are quantitative methods, and we're getting more accounting, right, than anything else. Now, inventories can be developed from a checklist by converting items to scale responses, right? So the perceived importance of completing a task might be something that you're interested in, right? Can also rank order on the basis of priority or frequency. How important do you believe that, and you can prioritize tasks then. This is my most important task. This is a less important. One of the things about rank ordering the priority of tasks is, let's suppose that my applicants come in and I say, my applicants are coming in and I want to test my applicants on their ability to do these tasks. They will, in this job, do 20 tasks. But let's face it, 3 tasks use up 80% of the incumbent's time. So really, what I'm interested in with my applicants is what might their predicted performance be on these 3 priority tasks rather than the entire list of 20. Again, we're looking at being efficient and we're looking at staying in budget, right? Because that's one of the things about being a manager is you often have to deal with your budgets. Now, inventories can be easy to analyze, and we're going to look at some pre-existing inventories as well. Smaller N's, that is smaller number of participants, is okay. Can be difficult and time-consuming to create. You can see we've almost run through a 3-step process to get to inventories. But most effective when developed for a specific context, specific organization. You might take an extent inventory, talent inventory, and then modify it based on your interview technique so that you can modify it for what you specifically need it for. Standard checklists, they're convenient. You can buy them. There's people who will sell these to you, consultants, right? So it costs money, but they are convenient. And there's a trade-off here because you have to consider now, right? You're a human resources professional. Is it more efficient for me to spend the time creating this, or is it better that I go out and buy a pre-packaged element? And there's a lot of trade-offs to those questions that you need to consider. One of the reasons I find these careers in human resources, job analysis, so fascinating, because there's so much to consider. And if you're looking for something to really exercise your gray matter and give yourself a sense of accomplishment when the day is done, man, this is it. And the extent to which they conform to the actual context can vary. Had enough quantitative methods yet? Well, we're not quite done. So, large number of incumbents are preferred when using standard checklist, but we've already described that. And need to make sure that all possible tasks are included. Again, that was a caveat that we'd previously discussed. So, what does homework 4C, quantitative methods, look like? Number 7, using your information from either 1, 2, or 3 above. Remember 1, 2, or 3? Go back to one of those jobs using the information, convert to an inventory checklist that allows participants to select what they do and then to rank order their perceived importance of the items. Also design a way, right, for the user to communicate the estimate of time on each item. This can be used as part of the verification process in observing the job. So note, once you've developed these and run through them and say, hey, these are pretty good, and I developed a wealth of information, you might go back and say, I'm going to take one more step. I'm going to spend the next 2 days observing the job to verify what has been reported, right? So now, the first individual groups the SMEs. Let us verify the info on a new sample of incumbents, right? And so we don't use the same people over again. We use a new set to verify these concepts. So let's go back to Snow White. I know, it's a very simple and somewhat silly example, but let's check it out. So for homework 4, what are we looking at? Well, task. So I've developed a task list, and let's say that I did individual interviews with the 3 Snow Whites that work at Disney World and the 4 Snow Whites that work at Disneyland, right? And I generated the task list, and here's just a small portion of the task list, right? So now this is for verification examples. I ask then the incumbents, let's say I generated it at Disney World and I want to check it at Disneyland. I say, task, smile. And then I ask the person, is this a task you perform, yes or no, right? Task, pose for pictures. Is this something you actually do? And you say yes, right? Verbally interact with guests, yes, right? And then for each one of these, we rank the importance, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being most important thing that you do and 1 the least important, then how important do you believe this task is, right? Okay. And then time spent per 8-hour shift in hours doing this. And we see that Snow White, unfortunately, is cracking her face by the end of the day. She goes home with her face hurting because she had to smile 7.5 hours of the day. Now, note, there's another thing that we can use here as well. That is, we can get verification from supervisors or managers. And we can say, hey, we have been interviewing Snow Whites, and this is what they told us they do. Right? And then we can show it to the supervisor, the manager, and said, is this what they're supposed to be doing? We can uncover need for various training issues. Notice it can be kind of used in a needs assessment fashion to a certain extent. I know. And it's going to be longer than this. Your example is going to be longer than this. I'm just giving you a brief example of what it might look like. Right? Doesn't have to look exactly like this, but it's going to resemble collecting information in a similar manner. So, decision point. Complex decision. Is it better to create lists in-house or use pre-existing inventories? Consider the pros and cons in each. Time. It's probably less time to use something that's pre-prepared. But you do have to research them, and you do have to verify that they're good instruments to begin with, right? So maybe overall it takes less time to generate your own than to take someone else's and perhaps modify it or do the shopping for them. The accuracy and completeness. To what extent will a purchased instrument be as accurate or be as complete as what you need, or is an in-house instrument better? What's the cost? What's it going to cost me to generate my own instrument? What's it going to cost me to purchase an instrument? Potential for creating job ownership. Now, this is where it kind of gets interesting and builds to self-type qualities. To the extent that I bring my people in, I bring my workers and say, hey guys, you know, you guys have been doing such a bang-up job in the warehouse, I can't even begin to express our gratitude. You've done such a good job that we're going to add another shift. We would like your participation in job analysis so we hire people that you want to work with. So you bring people on board to the hiring process and you say, you're going to be the experts on this job and we're going to do the job analysis with your, you know, irreplaceable help. All right? Notice how I'm building people up. But now, existing incumbents, that is the incumbents, the existing employees, start to feel involved with hiring people they're going to work with. They're going to own this shit, right? And notice what that does to their self-concept, their self-esteem, and what it's going to do to potential future camaraderie and breaking down barriers between management and workers. And one thing the worker wants as much as anything, the four most valuable words, according to Tom Peters, business guru, the four most valuable words that you can ask any employee: what do you think? And if you build this process, incorporating people into what do you think, it's going to have nothing but benefits for your organization. Right? Notice also that you're opening the door to, hey, this is the techniques we use to hire people. So you might be grooming workers into positions, supervisory or management positions. So to the extent that this is an open, transparent process, right, we can do a lot more than simply hire good people. We can also enhance our relationship with existing people. So, to what extent might we consider involving others as part of the development and increase organizational identity and commitment? Positive qualities, to be sure. So there's a lot to consider, right? There's the details, the bare bones to consider, but there's also a tremendous big picture to consider in an organizational context. Now, you'll be able to check out the PAQ, so you can check this out online, and I will also, I've got some PDF materials for the PAQ. We'll be looking at it later in the course, but what is the PAQ? It's designed to help facilitate the analysis of positions, right? So it's just a tool in that regard. There's 162 scales, yeah, no shit, right? Developed via factor analysis, and that's a great class if you ever want to take that statistics class. I had a graduate level factor analysis. Oh boy, it was fun. Or not. With Dr. Brown, I love Dr. Brown, but I was in his office hours every week. It was a difficult course, but then he was making us do a lot of it by hand, matrix algebra, instead of just using computer programs, so we would understand what we were doing. Seems like anytime someone says, we're going to do this by hand so you can understand what you're doing, I end up understanding less, at least for a short period of time. So, large number of elements of jobs. So, examples: information input, thinking processes that are employed, right? Interpersonal activities. So notice when we think about, let's say, take the role of lecturer, information input. To what extent do we consume information, right? Or input information? To what extent do we engage in a thinking process? And wouldn't you know, this transition away from midterms and this transition to project-based courses, one of the most challenging aspects I find is thinking up assignments. And I really have to, this course is pretty easy because the assignments kind of just spell themselves out. But I'll tell you what, I'm struggling right now. I've been working on Psych and Law. I'm up to Chapter 5, Eyewitness Testimony. So I'm going to build an assignment, a meaningful assignment that people want to do and walk away increasing their knowledge on an eyewitness testimony. This one's been a struggle, right? It's really challenging my imagination. This is a thinking process. if you were to analyze my job and then you said, to what extent, does your job require thinking or creating new ideas or developing new activities or exercises, there's a significant portion of that. Time-wise, it might not be a significant portion, but devoting mental energy to it is extensive, right? So, interpersonal activities. So, office hours might count with that, or Zoom sessions within the context of my job. Physical, psychological features of the environment. Okay. One thing that teachers might have a problem with, and it happens in some classes, is what does a teacher do when they're challenged in class about the material or whatever? How do they respond? What does it feel like? What is your plan for dealing with that, right? Do we want to employ teachers who, when challenged in class, do we want people to say, my wife and I were just talking about this yesterday, do we want people to say, I don't know? I do. I want teachers who, if you ask me a good question, in class, then I want people who will say, I don't know. That's a great question. I really don't know. And then we take it from there and say, how might we find out, right? What do we need to know to answer that question? What do we need to explore? Where could we, come to some kind of conclusion about that question, right? Or do you want to hire people who essentially, for whatever reason, maybe insecurity, right, won't admit that they don't know, and now go on to create an explanation, which may be a good explanation or not, but might be disseminating disinformation at that point. So again, this is a skill, right, that could be used within the context of being an instructor. The big question, of course, and this is what we're going to move through in this course, is how do we measure that an applicant has what we need in that context or not? So, right, Quincy, how you doing, buddy? You came up to hang out with us? All right. So, physical, psychological features of the environment, right? Or how do you feel about working a different shift every week? How do you feel about being cold and wet at work, right? These are all things that we might consider. And then miscellaneous features, schedules, and shifts. So if we go to the PAQ, then, and I'll provide you some links. There was a link there and some information. Each PAQ scale is benchmarked with explicit examples, and this is one of the reasons that using pre-existing measures can be such a blessing for us, right? Let's suppose that we're analyzing a job and we say, well, to what extent is dexterity important? That is manual dexterity, the ability to make movements with the fingers. And we say, and this is the job analysis. So what you do is you look at the job, or you sit down with interviews and you say, as far as doing your job, to what best captures the way that you manipulate your fingers in the group. Do you, in fact, make delicate movements like a surgeon? And someone who's a surgeon or wants to be a veterinarian, or let's say a watchmaker, would say, yeah, I make exceedingly delicate movements as part of my job. It's part of the job requirement, right? Okay. Make delicate movements like adjusting a camera. Now note, that takes a lot less fine skill than it does being a surgeon. But manipulating a camera, I'm looking at my camera right now, it's got like 87 dials and whistles on it, right? And to be a photographer, you have to manipulate those. You have to manipulate them probably without looking at them while you're doing your job. Make some movements like packing small things in boxes. So for hiring people for Amazon, perhaps, maybe this is more akin to what they do, but probably not. This is probably what manufacturers, if you're in the packaging area, in a manufacturing plant, you probably do this. The people at Amazon who actually shove boxes around probably don't have to operate at this level of precision. They're more like make gross movements such as moving furniture or moving boxes from one line to another. Or how many of you have worked for like UPS? In packing the trucks, right? So what's important there is speed, but fine motor movement isn't really required. Okay. And then make no finger movements whatsoever. That we don't have to test for that. Now, note that if making delicate movements like a surgeon is, yes, this job then is described as that, Another thing is we want to know how often and to what effect, right? So that we can prioritize this. Is this something we should be testing incoming applicants and their ability to do? And note, this is pretty, when you look at it, if I'm going to test incoming applicants, then I provide them with something that allows me to assess their ability, their dexterity, right? So in construction, right, when I was a construction laborer, make some movements like packing small things in boxes. Yeah, probably, but it might be making delicate movements like it. No, not quite there. So in construction, as a construction laborer, I was probably in the middle, right? When I worked at the lumber mill, the first horrible job I had was just putting 1 by 2 inch separating sticks into channels that the machine used. That was about speed. It was gross movements, right? But it was highly repetitive. I would do that for 8 hours, just do nothing but pick these sticks up and put them in a slot. And this is what I would do for 8 hours, right, in 11 different slots. What then was the repetitive motion nature that made that task difficult. God, I remember first 2 weeks I was doing that job, I would wake up in the morning and my fists would be balled up from using my hands all night long, and it would take me about 20 minutes just laying in bed until I could actually physically open my hand, because they were so I just wasn't used to it yet. After a couple weeks you begin to get used to it, and you're better off. But so profiles can be produced for given jobs in a large database. So this is the great idea, the PAQ. A lot of the work is already done for us. PAQ examples can create in-house task list and structured design. So look for that stuff. I'll get it posted by frickin' Wednesday. I know. Why do I tell you times? Because who knows when you watch this. I'll have it posted by the 28th or so, I guess is the way to put it. Other standard inventories are out there. There's the work profiling system. There's the occupational analysis inventory, the job components inventory. But the one that I'm going to point us to again and again and again in this course is ONET, and that is the clearinghouse of all jobs and all job analysis, which has extensive lists of KSAOs, among other things. You'll have an assignment, multiple assignments where you explore ONET. Now, let's change techniques here, and I think this represents number 8. God, I don't know. My count might be off in your assignment. I'll probably have it up here in the next slide. Functional job analysis attempts to distinguish what people do from what gets done. So it's the person and the task, right? Worker functions are action verbs and task statements that are expanded upon by additional phrases. So this is a grammatical technique for the construction of job analysis elements. It's universal to a lot of the techniques we've discussed when you're essentially preparing a job analysis, that it fits a certain grammatical structure. Further, functional job analysis assumes that anything the worker relates to can be categorized as people, data, or things. So I know, well, what does this mean? Let's take a look, right? So sentence element, subject, who? Well, it's always the worker, so it's unstated, who. This is worker, right? Action verb, perform what action? Schedules appointments. So we might be looking at a personal assistant, you say, or an administrative assistant, right? Worker, what do they do? Schedule appointments. But when? Or why? Or upon whose instruction? Supervisor, caller, or memo. Usually a vague set it up. So what is one task this person does? Well, the worker schedules appointments at the behest of their supervisor, right? Specificity, using what tools? Worker schedules appointments when requested by supervisor using Microsoft Outlook, calendar, appointment, right? So notice that we build these statements on the basis of this FJA structure. One nice thing is we end up with a very consistent job analysis when we are looking who does what with on what circumstance using what process or device. Okay? So, in order to, and this is the key result area, in order to do what? To assure presence of those expected to be present at the meeting that was scheduled, right? So, and again, notice how I picked, as building this course is like a bird building a nest, so to speak. I've taken a thread from this text, I've taken a twig from another text, something else from another source, so that we can build ourselves up a complete course. This was from the Essentials of Personnel Selection. I do like that book, but it was lacking in some areas. So. Then homework 4, functional job analysis. Create 3 FJA statements for the job of. So now you pick one of your jobs, right? And you make 3 functional job analysis statements. Use this structure right here, right? So Snow White smiles at guests to create friendly impression. Who does what to whom, right? To what end? Snow White seeks opportunities to pose with guests so guests can take pictures to record their visits. So we go from noun to action verb and then the explanation of the purpose. Snow White discourages inappropriate touching while maintaining her smile. Think about that. Yeah. And I got a lot of stories about characters at Disneyland who have had to deal with these issues. Right? I got to be a character at Disneyland for a little while. What character do you think I was? Anyone? Well, if you say this guy keeps talking about Snow White, he must have a Snow White fixation. Could he have been a dwarf? And I was. I was one of the 7 dwarfs at Disneyland for a Christmas season. I'll leave you to guess which dwarf. And it was not personality based, so nice try. I was this given dwarf because I was 5 foot 8 inches tall, and someone who was this dwarf had to fit in the costume, which required someone who's 5 foot 8. Never mind. So, anyway, side note. In this description is the word her allowed. And I don't know what to say about this. When I wrote it, I immediately thought, oh my God, that is definitely a gender bias there. But isn't Snow White female? But is that appropriate anymore? Is Snow White being a female a bona fide occupational qualification? I don't know. I got no answer for that. I'll leave it to you guys. All right, let's talk critical incidents. Now, critical incidents, right? This is the analyst meets with incumbents or even SMEs, take your pick, maybe both, and ask them to recall things that position holders have done that have led to particularly notable outcomes, positive or negative. So, when someone just did something so well or created such a fantastic outcome, or when someone's action led to a disaster. These are critical incidents, both positive and negative, right? So we query these people for these critical incidents, right? We confine the descriptions to facts and try to eliminate any kind of inferences or opinion-based observations, right? Environmental factors, antecedents are noted. So what happened that led up to this occurrence, this critical incident, and then how did it play out, right? We can gain insight into crucial aspects of performance in this regard. It's one thing to hire someone who's capable of handling the day-to-day, which is what happens 95% of the time. But what about those special occurrences that really demand something extra from us? Is that something we want to look for when we're vetting our applicants, right? But note that critical incidents allow us to then assess this. For example, we had an instructor, we had a situation at Columbus State a while back, right, where a conflict occurred between 2 students in a classroom, and then it found its way out into the hall with then an ensuing fight in the hallway. We have instructors, but then it appears that a gun fell out at some point during the struggle, and the instructor, good friend of mine, Dr. Tom, right, handled this, that he intervened, confiscated the firearm, got everything taken care of, while another instructor came out and Dr. Tom was able to instruct that other instructor how to help in an efficient and useful manner. And it's like, wow, David's got some amazing people skills. He's also got a pretty high level of courage and a high sense of responsibility. He responded to this critical incident about as perfectly as anyone could have. Now, is that something that we should be prepared for, that we should be keeping as part of our hiring process in mind? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. That's kind of up for the discussion. But notice, it was a critical incident, and it was handled well. What can we learn? We know that David handled it well, but what about David? What knowledge, skill, ability, or other factor did he possess that facilitated that response in a positive manner? Is that something that we want to look for? Is it important enough to look for in our applicants and somehow test them for? So this is why critical incidents become so important, especially in very kind of mission-critical, subjective type jobs. Useful to develop employment interview questions. And I'll go back to the interviews. Interviews are no better than chance, but we can make interviews better, and it's going to be an assignment for us in this course. But based on that, what I can do then for an interview, a standardized interview, is I can say, okay, so let us imagine, let's create a scenario, and I'm talking to the applicant, right? I say, let's imagine, and then I spell out the situation. I create the situation based on what I learned from the critical instrument. Now I can ask them, what would you do? What would your response be? What would your greatest concern be? Right? And now notice though, I'm asking them how they would respond to a situation that could occur. And then we close the loop on the interview process because I have a rubric designed based on a superior performance. So they tell me, boom, 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 what they did, and then I can evaluate what they said they would do on the basis of this rubric that is pre-designed. And notice, every applicant would be asked the same question, and every applicant's response would be assessed using that single rubric. That way we have consistency in the applicant process. All right? Note 2, well, more on interviews later. So, last point, consider that last point, be prepared to apply to interview design. Imagine a situation, how would you handle? More on so that you like later. That critical incidents technique? I think that's pretty cool, and I think that really allows us to exploit our imagination in these scenarios. Let's then move to personality-based job analysis, and this is where we begin to get into an area where I might step back and say, to what extent should personality, which to me, one of the greatest sources of diversity is personality. Now notice, we always talk, diversity typically in terms of gender and color, but I think what's more interesting in a diversity perspective is diversity in personality. And then to what extent should I feel it's ethical, and notice, I'm going to pose it to you and I, right, rather than some legal framework. To what extent do I believe it's ethical to dive into someone's skull, that is, play with assess their psyche, and say that this psyche is a better match for this position than this other psyche, this component of personality, right? So, I want to acknowledge the genuine paucity of job analysis techniques that incorporate the element of personality. The Bowling Green research group developed an inventory to develop hypotheses for the efficacy of personality predictors of success in several trades. And Bowling Green, go figure, has got one of the top 5 industrial organizational psychology programs in the country. Little Bowling Green, who would think? But man, they are the leaders. And for those of you who want to go into IO psychology, if you get into Bowling Green, frickin' more power to you. I've had 1 or 2 students out of Org Psych in this class get into Bowling Green in the years I've been teaching. It's a tough one. It's a small program. They don't have a lot of people. Anyway, for examples, C, self-descriptive index. Okay, the Inwald personality inventory, the NEO. What's the NEO? The Big 5 personality construct, right? So the NEO, Job Profiler, and so Costa, McRae, and Kay have been with the NEO. But the idea is, does someone's Big 5 makeup predict successfully their performance on the job or not. If it doesn't, then we got no business using the Neo. If it does, then we do. And why is this important? Well, consider Nationwide Insurance has literally spent hundreds of thousands, maybe $1 million on using this new personality measure called Personalysis, which is bullshit, right? I've vetted it. It's entirely bullshit. But every Nationwide employee now has to do Personalysis, and now they have meetings regarding Personalysis and their personality. Their employee IDs, they all got new employee IDs, and on the back is their Personalysis profile. It's just an offshoot of the Jungian, the Myers-Briggs typology, which predicts frickin' nothing in an employment context. And yet they're spending a fortune on it. And they're just torturing their employees with this Personalysis bullshit. Can you imagine your Personalysis? That is, let's do your Myers-Briggs typology. Is that the human resources professional's business? If you're an ENTJ or whatever the hell else? Should any decisions be made on that, since there's no empirical support for its predicting performance on the job? People go crazy with this shit, and I'm always going to come back to the question, is it legitimate that we do this? Is it even ethical? To what extent does the world need to stop out here, right, instead of trying to delve in here? Up to you guys, right? That's something you consider. Now, the ultimate job description, and this is where we want to go. This is where the hell we're trying to get to. A written job description of the duties and responsibilities associated with the job itself. All right? The size and the type of organization, the department and job title, the salary range, the position, etc. Brief summary of the main responsibilities of the job. Brief summary of the occasional duties and responsibility of the job. Any special working equipment used on the job. Right? Why is that important? Well, guess what? When I left the Salem mill and went to the Wallula mill, I became the person who analyzed the data. And we got a lot of data out of the Salem mill. But the problem is the Salem mill would send us data, but they sent us paper data. That is data written on paper, right? And then we would have to transfer that data to other paper and maybe get it into a computer so we could analyze it. And I was like, you know what? I have a dream, if you will, that we're going to take a computer and we're going to put that computer at every quality control station in Salem. So the actual machine operator, when they're recording this data, will no longer record it on paper and send those papers to someone. They'll actually input the data directly into the computer in design templates, right? And then we'll be able to access that data via the internet. And oh, well, folks, think about this. This is 1994, so the internet is dial-up, right? And then we will get their data, right? And we'll feed it directly into our SQL server, into our database, so that we can analyze the data more readily and more easily. We will make better use of the data. Well, now, what happened, I was, I had to write up the purchase orders, and I took the computers down to Salem, and I installed them, and I wrote the programs to collect the data, and then I have to train the Will Sheeter operators to use the computers and to use the devices that we're using to input the data. Well, lo and behold, this gets them more money. Because now when you're a Will Sheeter operator, not only do you operate the Will Sheeter machine and all this other stuff, but now you have to be computer literate. You have to operate a PC. So we actually got them like an extra 17 cents an hour by developing this new task requirement for them that required a new skill, that is being able to use a computer, which was something that wasn't done in the past. Oh my God, what a task. That was a crazy idea. It was fun though. But I mean, and we use remote control software on the computers over the phone line, so it was crazy. Back in the day, let me tell you, when computers were kind of new, it was fascinating, and the internet was new. There was no Ethernet connections. This was all freaking dial-up, right? No Wi-Fi. This is all hardwired. So, any special equipment used on the job, let's record it. Any special working conditions, shift or weekend work, foreign travel. My dad worked at Disneyland in the Disneyland band. Guess what? The only Saturday and Sunday my dad ever got off was when he took his vacation. Otherwise, you work Saturday and Sunday at Disneyland. the days Disneyland was closed, and this is back in the day, old school Disneyland, mom and pop Disneyland, it was closed on Monday and Tuesday, right? So those were the days off. Or, yeah, I think. Don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. So, purpose and frequency of contact with others, if it's required, and the statement other duties is assigned to accommodate job changes and special requests that fit in there as well. Okay. So, guess what? Here we are. I think this is the 9th component of your homework. Yes, this is number 9. For any of the jobs you were given, create a job description. Your choice, right? So, include all points covered on this list from the lecture. At a very minimum, you can look at jobs on company websites for examples. And I have an example in the assignment from Columbus State for an instructor of criminal justice, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a good example, and feel free to use that example. People say, well, you know, but I got to be creative. I got to do my own thing. No, you don't. When it comes to job descriptions, you should do something that looks like other job descriptions. I mean, of the highest quality, but let us not strain people and present them with something that's odd or new. Keep it consistent, right? So, ethics check. Beyond predictive validity, which is something that we'll discuss extensively, how comfortable are we getting into one's head? And I'm returning to this question. To what extent is your personality an open book, or should it be off limits? To what extent should I subject you to tests in an employment, application situation that some people might consider invasive and others might not? This is something that you got to resolve within yourself, right? Note the power differential, because participants, right, can opt out and still receive full credit in the laboratory at Ohio State. And that's something that we tell participants, in the social psychology area when we're conducting experiments. Anytime you feel uncomfortable or anytime you don't like what you're doing, you are free to say, I don't want to do this anymore. You're free to get up, and you will still receive credit for participating in the experiment. Notice that doesn't work with a job applicant, right? Applicants don't feel that they can, I don't like performing this test, so I'm not going to perform this test because it makes me uncomfortable. And you know what that means. It means you're not going to get the job, right? So what constitutes digging too deeply into one's psyche, their attitudes, their private self, what have you? So job analysis cautions, different sources of information may yield different information. Job analysis can yield a lot of complex information, and yet critical performance aspects can be predicted quite accurately with very few variables, because ultimately, our end game is to do the job analysis, develop this tremendous list of tasks, but be able to say what person will do these tasks well, and develop 3 or 4 measures that we can give an applicant that predicts their performance on those tasks. Different jobs are going to require different techniques. There's no one size fits all, and that's one of the purposes of the extensive assignment that you have ahead of you. Job analysis tends to focus on how the job has and is done rather than how it could be done. So prescriptive job analysis is the work of people involved in continuous improvement and not necessarily in our situation. Other cautions: job analysis assumes there's one way to do a job, and that might not be the case. There might be multiple ways, but notice job analysis can also uncover those different ways and lead us to a best practices type of formula. Okay. Finally, no one method of job analysis is better than others across a large number of contexts. That's why we learn them all, and we learn the pros and cons so that we can make the best choices. Multiple methods, usually going to be the way to go. Job analysis ain't a one-shot activity, right? As times change, as markets change, as technology changes, so might the job, who's good, and then who is a good fit for that job. And thus analysis represents ongoing learning and continuous improvement. If instructors aren't observing what's happened over the last year, if they're not observing carefully, then they're missing the boat. We may be on the brink of a tremendous paradigm shift in education. We may see from this point on that in-person education becomes less and less frequent, and online education becomes more and more the case. And that can be very threatening, because one thing I loved more than anything when I started, by the time I found my feet, let's say in 2002, give me my first year, as kind of, but by the time 2002, 2003 came along, lecturing in front of a class and giving midterms was the frickin' bomb. And it probably was very well oriented at my skill set. It's not what we do anymore. Am I still well qualified to do this new job? Maybe, maybe not, right? So, concluding thoughts, job analysis, totally necessary. Even if it's relatively informally conducted, it's intended to be descriptive. That is, describe who does what, to what effect, using what, right? Provides a foundation for the eventual prescriptive qualities that might predict job performance, and that's where we want to go, is developing that list of person specifications from a thorough job analysis. Quality documentation is a must, because this initial job analysis is going to be used to support the person specifications, which is going to be used to support the tests that we give our applicants. And the analysis of those tests being fair, valid, reliable, is going to go back to the initial job analysis. And who knows, we might even uncover some very curious tidbits. So here's the deal. Your job, your academic training has given you many tools, right, to begin to learn to do, to understand, design job analyses. So you're already halfway there. We're going to practice the more detailed techniques. But understanding the experimental method, understanding psychometric tests and their properties, and understanding statistical analysis is clutch. Other tools like learning how to design a process, right, a program of analysis, etc. This is something that is coming to you. So all these, and the writing, all of these, man, you guys are prepared for this. This is where much of this has been leading if you choose to go this route. These are skills you're going to leave with, right? They may not have been taught in specific contexts of job analysis during your academic tenure here, but these general skills are readily adaptable to specific job analysis challenges. So I'm really looking forward to spending the rest of the course with you and just moving through these great opportunities that we have ahead of us to really show what the hell we're made out of, to demonstrate to ourselves and others what we've learned and what we're able to do and what we'll be able to do in the future. So, have a great day. Look at 2.11. It's going to be real brief and just kind of help update some of this idea, provide some examples. But 2.2 then gets into person specifications, and it's a logical extension of where we're going. Adios.